Welcome back to Pod Save the World. I'm Tommy Vietor.
I'm Ben Rhodes.
Ben, we are swapping geographic locations. This is a bi-coastal show. You're not back in New York. I'm back in L.A. Can you feel the Cuomo era unraveling under your feet?
Yeah, all around me here. It's actually like all anybody's been talking about here for the last couple of days. He's like dominated New York political landscape for a decade, so it's hard to overstate what a big deal it is for him to be out. None of the authoritarian behaviors were surprising. I think the depravity in the report, exceeded, I think, even some of his critics' view. And my parents, who liked his performance in COVID, even they were very much ready for this step as well. So we'll see.
Good riddance, Governor.
Again, he dominated New York state politics so much that it's wide open. There's no obvious, successor in the next election. So be interesting to see.
On the show today, we got a lot of good stuff. We're going to cover some, all the news out of Afghanistan is bad, so we're going to talk through all of it. We'll talk about Mike Pompeo and the missing Whisky, Sudan and Ethiopia, some big climate change news. Ben, I loved your interview last week, by the way.
Yeah.
The climate activist. She was very inspiring. COVID update. The Olympics are over, which is sad. We got some final updates. And then some space-based idiocy that I wanted to flag for you guys. So let's start in Afghanistan because we talked about it last week, but things have actually gotten considerably worse since that time. Over the last few days, 7 provincial capital cities have been overrun by the Taliban. That includes cities in provinces in northern Afghanistan that have historically been anti-Taliban and where local warlords and militia groups managed to hold territory even when the Taliban controlled Kabul back in the late 90s. The Afghan special forces are fighting heroically. They're doing all the heavy lifting, but they are reportedly exhausted and in some cases literally out of food. The regular army units are often retreating or disbanding or otherwise just not really fighting. The fighting is moving further and further into urban areas. Civilian casualties are increasing. The Taliban is also conducting a series of assassination campaigns against government officials and activists and civil society, including an attack on the acting defense minister's home in a heavily fortified neighborhood of Kabul that killed 8 people, not the defense minister, luckily. The U.S. is still conducting airstrikes on Taliban targets, but those flights are now based outside of the country because the U.S. handed over Bagram Air Base to the Afghans. And I suspect that the airstrikes generally are less useful if we're talking about urban combat because you can't just bomb urban targets. So Ben, these stories are just devastating. People who worked with the U.S. and the NATO are getting killed. Innocent civilians are getting killed. Thousands of Afghans are getting displaced or forced to live under Taliban control. Last week we talked about some criticism of Biden for withdrawing too quickly and not doing enough first to get military interpreters and others who worked with the U.S. out of the country. I think that's a separate issue. It's a valid one. But what we're seeing today is a different story, I think. I mean, these Taliban military advances suggest that there's a far bigger problem that, the U.S. has been in Afghanistan for 20 years. We spent trillions of dollars. More than 2,700 U.S. service members have been killed. Over 100,000 Afghans have been killed. But here's my question for you. I mean, you see these results, what's happening, the Taliban are taking over these capitals. Doesn't this tell us that this core mission of training and equipping the Afghan military has just fundamentally failed?
Yeah, I think it does. I mean, really, I was thinking about what angle we could discuss here, Tommy, because as you said, the news is the news, and it's pretty clear that the Taliban is just steadily advancing, even in places like Kunduz, not exactly their strongholds. And to me, people can make it an indictment of Biden's decision to leave, and we can talk about that, and we have talked about that, and the speed with which he left. But as you just alluded to, it's kind of an indictment of the entire theory of the case of this war effort. Not the destruction of al-Qaeda. I mean, that was a targeted mission where you go in and you try to take out certain terrorist safe havens. Obviously, that bled into Pakistan. Mm-hmm. But the model of training and financing this kind of massive Afghan security force as the entity that you could hand this over to, I think that needs to come under a lot of scrutiny because I think to a large extent, if you look at who's actually doing the bulk of the frontline fighting, it's these special forces, as you say. And there was this kind of almost the size was the goal of the Afghan National Security Forces.
Right.
And in order for them to sustain just their basic operations and their logistics, they were hugely dependent not just on the U.S. military, but also on private security contractors who were performing some of the basic functions for them. And now that those private security contractors are also leaving, it's hard for the Afghan National Security Forces to function. And so the idea of training kind of this massive military that you finance that has, as Biden himself said in a recent press conference, has more numbers, more hardware than the Taliban, but they're not like a cohesive, tight fighting force. Clearly that didn't work in Iraq, as we saw when Mosul was overrun by ISIS, and it hasn't worked here either. And so, yeah, I think there's there's going to be a lot of efforts put into looking back, but I think one of the basic points here is that our capacity to shape events in these distant countries that we don't understand that well, that the U.S. public doesn't have an appetite for staying for several decades, that we sometimes think, oh, we can construct a military, and if it's this size, it can get this amount of work done. That this is a lesson in the limits of what the U.S. can accomplish through military intervention itself. And because even if we kept that small force there, the Taliban was still advancing. They just weren't advancing at this speed. So it's not like everything was going well and then Biden pulled out and the bottom fell out. It's like, no, everything was already deteriorating, and then that deterioration accelerated with this pullout. And I think that should teach us that the model where we think we can engineer events in other countries through military action, hasn't borne out in either Iraq or Afghanistan, and it's something we should take a lot of stock of 20 years after 9/11.
Yeah, or build a military in the same sort of image as our own. I mean, here's a question that I bet the Biden folks are debating right now, which is, you're seeing these district capitals topple quickly. There's real concern now about whether Kabul will be next, or or how quickly Kabul will fall. I believe that right now there are 4,000 people working at the U.S. Embassy in Kabul, including 1,400 diplomats. There are 650 U.S. troops on the ground still defending the embassy, I believe. That embassy compound is a fortress. But, I mean, at what point do you think the U.S. government will start thinking about whether it's safe to have a diplomatic presence in Afghanistan? Because, I mean, it would work. Look, if I were serving there right now, I would be pretty worried.
Yeah, I think at a certain point, they're clearly just going to make a decision. What I think they hoped for in a best case scenario is that with the U.S. withdrawal, I think it was inevitable the Taliban was going to make some advances. But I think what they hope for is that the Afghan government and security forces could hold some territory, and that some kind of stalemate would emerge that could then kind of be channeled into a diplomatic negotiation. And in the current trajectory of events, it's hard to see what the Afghan government can hold at all. Maybe like an island of Kabul. But I think what they'll have to decide is, in addition to kind of continued airstrikes, are we prepared to deploy more military force to just keep Kabul from falling, so that at least there's some outpost of a different political force and military force in Afghanistan that can allow you to have some protracted effort to get into negotiations. Right now it feels like with the current momentum, it's very unlikely that that they can hold out in Kabul and some other cities. But that's gonna bring some tough decisions in the White House as to whether you deploy some at least more robust air power on a more sustained basis to create hopefully some kind of perimeter around Kabul.
Yeah, and the statements out of the White House make it sound like there's no way they're sending troops back in. Just before we started recording, Zalmay Khalilzad, the U.S. official leading the peace negotiations with the Taliban, put out a statement where he warned the Taliban that a government that takes power by force won't be recognized internationally. I mean, maybe he's working with the best diplomatic stick he has available to him, but I can't imagine the Taliban giving a shit about that.
No, and look, the Taliban wasn't recognized internationally by many countries back when it ruled Afghanistan before 9/11, and that they didn't seem to give a shit about that. And we've even seen, in recent weeks, Taliban delegation received in China, so there are countries that are going to deal with them as a if not a recognized government of Afghanistan, at least as an authority inside of Afghanistan. I do think, to come back to this point that we've hit a few times, but it can't be stressed enough, it's this question of who to try to evacuate, I think should not be restricted just to kind of military interpreters or just to people who worked, with U.S. media organizations, as has been discussed. But there are a lot of people that were USAID contractors or a lot of organizations that got grants from USAID to set up, women's rights organizations, human rights organizations. I really do think that if the Biden team has decided, and it's a decision that, you and I have expressed some understanding of, that there's just diminishing returns for having a U.S. military presence. At some point, we're going to have to leave. It's been 20 years. I do think that there's a higher threshold of responsibility to get as many people out who work with us as possible. And again, not just people who were like employed by the military, but people who were like started organizations that receive funding from the United States because we encouraged them to stand up for women's rights or girls' education or human rights. Because when you think of the most horrific scenarios, it's the kind of mass retribution taken out on those people, many of whom are based in Kabul. And frankly, if you are headed to a scenario where what you're kind of hoping for, and hope is not the best word for such a grim scenario, but is that the Taliban, kind of once again discredits itself by the way it rules and invites greater opposition to it over time. You need those people to stay alive, and those people who represent Afghan civil society in an alternative future, so that if things change in however many years, like you have people that can go back and help put the pieces back together. So there's moral reasons, and there are also practical reasons why you would want to save as many people as possible who've kind of participated in this project of trying to have an Afghanistan that represents the rights of all its people, not just the Taliban's agenda.
Okay, that was a very grim topic. So let's talk about something very stupid, which is Mike Pompeo. So, failed former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo is in the news because of a missing bottle of whiskey. In 2019, the government of Japan gave Pompeo a bottle of whiskey worth $5,800. Can't imagine paying that much for whiskey, but the gift itself isn't that weird. Foreign governments often give the president or give senior members of the president's staff these lavish gifts that basically immediately get recorded, taken away by the State Department, and then the recipient can either turn it over to the National Archives forever or buy it back with their own personal cash. But this special bottle of booze went missing. And Mike Pompeo was asked about this by Fox News last week in a moment of accidental journalism by the Fox News team. And he kind of stuttered and stammered and said it never got to him, but that if it had been Diet Coke, he would have drank it. It was kind of the joke he attempted. Yeah. What's your take, Ben? Where is the bottle? Do you believe, Mike, that he didn't just slug this thing down on the plane ride home?
I'll never forget the time we went on our first trip to Saudi Arabia in 2009. And I arrived at my little guest house that I was staying at. Each of the staff was assigned to one. And there was a suitcase full of jewels. This little suitcase that I opened, and it had a necklace and a watch, or I don't know what was in it. And I thought that they were trying to bribe me because I was working on
all
the
you guys were
speech,
what the fuck?
So I was like, oh my God, did I just get this? But then Favreau was staying in the same compound as me, and he got the exact same gift. And then it turned out everybody got a suitcase full of jewels. And that's when the State Department explained to us, oh no, don't worry about it. We just take it. We'll let you know if you want to buy this. And I think it was valued at tens of thousands of dollars or something. Nobody ever does that, right?
I like that they gave you the chance to stash it in your bag before telling you that they knew that the jewels were in there.
These gifts are given protocol office to protocol office. So what's very weird about this, right, is that normally there wouldn't even be a question. The bottle of whiskey would go to the State Department protocol people, just take it back and put it in whatever warehouse they put it in, or I think maybe they sell some of this stuff for charity or something. It's very weird that this kind of multi-$1,000 bottle of whiskey is what goes missing. Knowing Pompeo, he's probably not the kind of guy that had a good time with this whiskey. He probably re-gifted it to some Koch brothers type donor, maybe it was served, Tommy, at the Madison dinners,
Yeah, I thought about that. I bet he got drunk and yelled at his staff, which just kind of sounds like what.
Well, no, but I love this guy throwing the State Department under the bus, because he kind of made another sneering thing about how if anybody fucked this up, it was clearly the State Department. What a great boss Mike Pompeo is, how'd you like to work for that guy? And he's throwing you under the bus for every single thing that happens, including the fact that he lost a several $1,000 bottle of whiskey.
Yeah, you drank it, you Schlubby bully.
You drank it or you regifted it, man.
Yeah,
Come
you're
on.
the worst. Some news out of Sudan. So our friend USAID Administrator Samantha Power took a visit to Sudan. She went to Khartoum. She gave a major speech. She announced some additional humanitarian assistance, and she also visited a refugee camp that hosts Ethiopians who have been driven out of Ethiopia because of the civil war there, the conflict in Tigray. Then sort of some interesting news on top of that, Ben. Sudan's transitional government voted unanimously to join the International Criminal Court, or ICC. I'm sure this was a pretty remarkable trip for Samantha, who is, one of the world's experts on the genocide that happened in Darfur, visited there under very different circumstances a long time ago. Ben, what do you think it would mean if Sudan joined the ICC and people like former Sudanese President Omar al-Bashir were handed over for prosecution?
It'd be like a tremendous sign that international justice can work. Like, one of the reasons, this is momentous for two reasons. One is on the international justice front. Bashir was kind of the poster boy of impunity for years because he'd been indicted by the ICC and he kind of flaunted it and was like, screw you. And he kind of pressured other countries, particularly in Africa, to say, don't cooperate with the ICC, continue to deal with me. And his ability to get away with that kind of undercut the credibility of the court. I think if he is prosecuted, what that demonstrates is at some point, justice is coming for you. That like you may evade this for 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, but whether you're the Burmese junta or whether you're someone like Bashir, whoever you are, like once you get tarred with that indictment, like just because you can evade it for a period of time doesn't mean the justice isn't coming. And that's a very powerful message. I think it's also a reminder that like pretty extraordinary political events have happened in Sudan. That you had this kind of mass mobilization for democracy that successfully did oust Bashir and did lead to a transitional government. Look, there's huge challenges there. There's still a pretty entrenched military. There's like some autocratic neighbors, particularly our friends in the Gulf, who like to pour money in there and don't want to see a full democracy. But, things continue to progress somewhat in Sudan. It's a sign that when people stand up and demand change, like they can see tangible results. It's also a sign, though, that very fragile transition, one of the things that's putting it at risk is this conflict next door in Ethiopia and Eritrea that risks kind of spreading and pulling in neighbors, and so it's yet another reason why people should be concerned about the direction of events in Tigray.
Yeah, and just before we started recording, I saw that the Ethiopian Prime Minister, Abiy Ahmed, has called on civilians to join the army in the fight against the northern rebels in Tigray. The rebels up in the north had staged this major offensive, had taken back a lot of the territory that they lost, but calling on civilians to join the fighting seems like a very bad sign that this war is going to escalate and not end anytime soon. So it's something we should keep watching.
It's a reminder that these situations that are already tragic can get worse. I mean, because a situation when everybody's turned into a combatant, including civilians, is a recipe for just a lot of suffering and instability. And so the imperative of trying to get this into some peace process and some kind of ceasefire and negotiation, that continues to be acute. And this is something that the Biden administration and a lot of other governments, and hopefully governments in Africa, step up. Because if you look at organizations like the African Union, which is based in Ethiopia, if you look at all these neighbors, like Kenya, like important countries, they're going to suffer if this conflict continues to go off the rails. And so a lot of countries have a lot of interest at stake in preventing further deterioration here. And never mind the human beings caught in the middle of this.
Speaking of a lot of countries having a stake in preventing further deterioration, let's talk about climate change, because the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, released a massive new climate report that was based on an analysis of more than 14,000 different studies, and it paints a very bleak picture. So here are some key takeaways. One, the report is just unequivocal about the fact that humans are warming the planet by burning fossil fuels, and that the impact is being felt literally everywhere. The CO2 we've released already has basically locked in more warming and extreme weather for the next 30 years. And the rate of change in areas like sea level rise is happening more quickly than before, so things are accelerating. If the world does nothing, the temperature could rise from 3 to 6 degrees Celsius, which would be catastrophic. But if we are aggressive and there's a global effort to cut emissions, that could limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. So there's some hope here. Just a personal aside, then I also hope that industry is figuring out some way to pull carbon out of the atmosphere to help with this effort. But, governments need to act first. So, this study is especially valuable because it draws this link between extreme weather events and climate change, and that is important because a lot of people don't do that. They don't think climate change will impact them personally. But I think here's the big question. The next UN climate change conference is coming up in November. Do you think this report will do enough to get the world to come together and to act at the scale that's necessary? Because, we've seen that not necessarily happen in some of the recent summits.
I had a lot of thoughts and feelings in reading the summaries of this report. I don't think you can emphasize enough how selfish, reckless, short-sighted, and really cruel the climate denialism in governments like our own has been over the years. I mean, what is it going to look like to future generations that Donald Trump stood up and pulled out of the Paris Agreement and said he cared about Pittsburgh and not Paris, and that our politics, I mean, to do a little media criticism here, covers that, as if it's oh, that's a valid political argument. This evidence has been clear for decades, and we've literally had people obstructing climate action, not just refusing to join it, but even the infrastructure bill that passed today. They had to pass a bill that could get bipartisan support that basically stripped out most of the important climate provisions, because God forbid any even moderate Republican would have to vote for that. That is going to look insane. It's almost hard to get your mind around the negligence. I think the second point then that leads to is that for people like us who talk about foreign policy, international relations, you read a report like that and you realize at some point we're going to wake up completely to this. And this is going to be the only thing that people do. The issue that governments work on together, the issue that the U.S. government has to be structured to deal with is going to be climate change for a period of decades. And you would hope that the combination of extreme weather events that we've already had and the reports that have come out like this will make that moment now. Because what needs to happen at Glasgow is there needs to be a kind of transformation of the ambition that governments have in terms of the targets they're setting, in terms of the actions that they're taking, so that they can literally transform the entire global economy into something that can leave the earth habitable, And that's going to take governments, spending money and having much stricter regulations. That's going to require people who invest money to only invest in clean energy. That's going to require all of us making different choices about the types of places that we live and the types of energy that we use. It's a whole of society effort that needs to start yesterday. Glasgow will be an opportunity, but I'm not that optimistic that we can get there. I think it does point to how important it is for this second infrastructure bill, the reconciliation bill, to go through so that the U.S. has some momentum when we go there and we can say, hey, we just spent X amount of money transforming our energy grid so that we can meet, the goal of being carbon neutral by 2050. But we'll see. We'll see if we can get it done in that timeline.
You're also seeing some sort of near-term political fallout, right? I mean, there are these major fires in Greece, and some people are blaming immigrants, others are blaming Turkey, some are blaming corporate interests. So the spillover effect into politics, especially right-wing politics, will be devastating. I'm going to road test a slightly lighter message that people can use for their Republican friends. So, according to some reports I read, Ben, bad weather is forecasted to reduce France's wine production by 30% this year. Bad weather in Italy is going to reduce their output by 10%. Winemakers in California are struggling to grow grapes in these heat waves. So here's a message for your drunk Fox News watching relatives. Deal with climate change, or you cannot slug Chardonnay and yell at me about Obama's birth certificate this Thanksgiving. Yeah. Do you think that will work?
I mean, I hope so, except I was thinking about this too, Tommy, is it's so clear what's happening. It's so clear that we're suffering extreme weather events because of this. But if people won't even get vaccinated, I know. To protect themselves, why would they support national policies that do? I mean, we can do this, I mean, we it's a problem with the solution in terms of policies that can be pursued. Maybe that message can work. I mean, I also think we have to remember that it's going to require countries to say things like, okay, we're not going to trade with Brazil if they keep burning down the Amazon. Like, it's going to take that kind of collective effort of like, voting off the island the people that refuse to deal with this. Unfortunately, the United States has often been the country that refuses to deal with it whenever we've had a Republican president. But yeah, maybe the Chardonnay can be a wake-up call. I don't know.
I'm trying something here. Burning to death to own the libs, though. That's what we're dealing with. You mentioned COVID, so some good news there. The Pentagon announced that members of the U.S. military will be required to get a COVID-19 vaccine starting in mid-September. That timeline gives the FDA the chance to complete its inexplicably long process and give final approval to the Pfizer vaccine. So the Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, framed the issue as impacting military readiness, saying, quote, "To defend this nation, we need a healthy and ready force." Seems obvious. President Biden backs his plan. The Pentagon says that more than 1 million troops are fully vaccinated. Another 237,000 more have had one shot. The Navy is doing the best in terms of the service branches. They have the highest percentage of active and reserve sailors vaccinated, with 74% having gotten one shot. The Army is bringing up the rear with closer to 50% vaccinated. Service members are already required to get lots of other vaccines. The exact list depends on your location. So this seems like a good step and a piece of the puzzle that will get us closer to having the federal workforce in country vaccinated. But here's my question for you, Ben. Do you think DOD will actually punish the few holdouts who refuse to take it? And do you worry at all that those people become like right-wing celebrities once it happens?
I mean, you can guarantee that there'll be some Marjorie Taylor Greene press conferences with some, soldier who refuses to take a vaccine. Yeah, they'll be
doing CrossFit and not getting the jab.
Yeah, I think that this is great leadership by DOD as the most respected institution in the country. Like, for them to take this step with so many people in that institution. That's what they should do. They should be like at the forefront of modeling the kind of behavior that we should see in other institutions, right? Lloyd Austin has been, there's things that we've criticized about some foreign and defense policies. On these matters of kind of personnel, he deserves a lot of credit. They've taken sexual assault cases out of the chain of command to ensure better justice for victims and survivors. A huge step that was long overdue. They restored the rights of transgender people to serve in the military. Now they're taking this step on vaccines. You're definitely seeing a lot of integrity and a lot of leadership from DOD on how it's approaching its own behavior as an institution and what that's modeling for the rest of society. So definitely tip a cap there, but you're definitely going to have some dead enders, making common cause with Matt Gaetz and Tucker Carlson and Marjorie Taylor Greene. Yeah.
I can already feel the press conferences. Some dumber COVID news along those same lines as the Marjorie Taylor Greene. So some anti-vaccine activists in the UK tried to storm the offices of the BBC because they were mad that
I love this.
the BBC was encouraging people to get the coronavirus vaccine. But unfortunately, they stormed the wrong address. They entered a building or tried to enter a building that now houses apartments, restaurants, and studios that make daytime talk shows. So great work there to our British friends.
Well, the best is that they had the whole premise of them storming the BBC was that they'd done the research about the fucking vaccine, and then they hadn't even done enough research to know that the BBC wasn't in this building and hadn't been there for years. I mean, just maybe you're not doing the right research, guys. Maybe your sources on 5G or microchips in the vaccine are the same sources that led you to think that the BBC is in a building it hasn't been in a few years,
Yeah, maybe not so much louder with Crowder. The Washington Post had a good write-up of the whole incident, Ben, and it noted in this story, I had missed this, 2 men at an anti-COVID lockdown protest in Sydney, Australia last month were arrested and charged because they punched a police horse. So great stuff happening at these anti-vax protests all around.
I mean, come on. Can we just lay off the horses at least? I mean, it's bad enough that you guys got to put us all at risk.
That actually, oddly, is a good transition to our Olympics section because the Olympics are over. They were fun while they lasted. The Paralympics are starting, so we can all still get our fix of great competition. There was also a horse punching incident, I believe, in one of the events that I don't understand that involves 7 different things, including horses jumping over shit. But the thing I wanted to flag for you, Ben, is apparently Chinese state media are trying to claim that China actually beat the U.S. when it comes to the total Olympic medal count.
Oh, come on, guys.
By claiming that medals won by Taiwan and Hong Kong belong to China. Your response.
Oh, right. Okay, come on, guys. Well, first of all, they were doing end zone dances like halfway through the competition about their lead in the gold medal count. And I'm sorry you guys just couldn't get it done. I mean, I'm sorry that like we eclipsed you in the final days because our extraordinary U.S. women won another gold medal in basketball. So did our men, of course. We racked up the medals in track like we always do. Like, just deal with it, right? And now you're going to tell me that you're going to count like Taiwanese medals? The people that want nothing to do with you because they're so appalled by what you've done in Hong Kong. Like, give me a fucking break. And putting aside the jingoistic Olympics cheerleading here, we're entering into like what's going to be a pretty intense year of debate about the Beijing Winter Olympics in 2022.
Yeah.
That's looming out there because like you can bet there's going to be growing calls to boycott that or to at least downscale participation in some fashion. So, but for the time being, like we won, just deal with it. Like scoreboard is what it is.
Yep. A weird aside here. I don't know if you saw the women's diving competition. The Chinese women are incredible. They're some of some of the highest scores ever in the history of diving. But I found it really odd that like these are 13-year-old kids getting pushed literally off a high dive and forced to train for Olympics. Something about it just seemed off to have a kid that young being forced to train like that. That's not a China thing. That's an Olympics
respect
thing,
for well, it is. Well, here's the thing. I have a lot of respect for Chinese athletes. Like, there's some extraordinary Chinese athletes. I love watching them. I like watching the athletes from all the countries. I like that we win the medal count, but like I'm happy when other countries win medals. There is something like I'll put it this way. Like, if we had not won the medal count, I wouldn't really have given that much of a shit.
Same.
You used to get the sense in the Soviet Union days that there was this kind of maniacal focus on pushing these athletes, and often that led to doping, right? And like it's supposed to be fun. You know, it's all these weird sports, and when you look at the American athletes, it's these people that they've been doing diving, or they've been doing gymnastics, or they've been doing water polo since they were like little kids, and they just happened to be good at it when they were 5, and then they went into some programs and they were just really good. But I don't get the sense that like the U.S. Olympic Committee is, like sitting there trying to program athletes from some young age so they can map out what the medal count's going to be 4, 8, 12 years from now. If we are doing that, we shouldn't be. I mean, it's supposed to be fun. And yes, while there's a professionalization of some of these sports, like most of this is pretty amateur. Speaking of which, you mentioned equestrian. Like, do you feel old realizing that like Bruce Springsteen's daughter won like an Olympic medal in equestrian? Like, I had no idea that Bruce had a daughter who was like an Olympic athlete,
I mean, good for the boss. I do think the equestrian stuff, look, it's kind of cool, I guess. I don't know. It just sort of seems like kids who can afford the best horse are going to win, no?
Well, Springsteen sold some albums, and, I'm sure she had a good horse, right? I mean, like we went through this with Mitt Romney.
I feel like Bloomberg's daughter was a really good equestrian.
Bloomberg's daughter, Romney had that dressage horse, Rafalka. Like, let's just keep the Olympics fun if we can. I'm looking forward to Paris. That'll be a cool venue. We look next to Summer Olympics. We got Paris and LA.
Yeah,
I mean, that's pretty awesome. And you don't have to worry that much about politics.
Okay, my final story I wanted to flag for you, Ben, is so stupid that I kind of wonder whether it's fake. So Business Insider reported that a Canadian startup is working with SpaceX, Elon Musk's company, to build a satellite with a pixelated display screen that can display advertising. Logos, art, whatever you want on it, I guess. And then they're going to launch it into orbit. So we'll have space ads. So from there, a selfie stick will display and live stream whatever is on this screen to YouTube and Twitch. This monument to, I guess, capitalism and human stupidity is supposed to pollute our skies sometime in 2022. People will be able to buy ads with various cryptocurrencies because, of course.
Oh, that's perfect.
Yes. Yeah. So here's my question. What idiotic nonsense do you think gets displayed first? Is it going to be like a Dogecoin meme, some sort of genitalia? Like, how dumb can we get this thing?
Well, I think it'll be like the, crypto utopian late stage capitalist kind of messaging, right? I mean, like, honestly, if you tried to write a dystopian book about capitalism going to space like 50 years ago, and came up with the premise that in the 2020 space would become a place where billionaires have dick measuring contests about how high up they can go in rockets that they paid for personally, and then crypto guys were broadcasting ads that aliens like, what is the impression that we're giving these alien civilizations who are studying us?
Yeah.
Can you imagine what they're thinking? They're looking at us from like a couple galaxies over. There's some really smart beings who've been studying us like mice in a laboratory, and what they see is climate change happening. So they see these people burning this beautiful planet that they have while billionaires are flying up into space and then figuring out ways to sell advertising there, like rather than dealing with the climate crisis. Like, can we just get the priorities in the right order?
Yeah. Can
that be compatible with capitalism, please? Because if it's not, we are going to burn ourselves to death here.
Building satellites with selfie sticks.
What's your money on for the first ad?
Oh, I'm assuming some sort of penis drawing would be my money. But you mentioned like techno-utopian. So Jack Dorsey tweeted yesterday, wrote this down, Bitcoin will unite a deeply divided country and eventually world. That was the end of his tweet. And it just made me so unbelievably mad because I think I just finished An Ugly Truth, which is the new New York Times reporter book about Facebook. And it details all the ways that the like Silicon Valley naive techno-utopianism led to bad decisions and real world harm, like doing nothing but hate speech in the U.S., Burma, anti-vaccine disinfo, et cetera. And like, I actually like Jack Dorsey. I think he's smart. I think seems like a good person. But these same guys now want us to trust them when it comes to creating like digital currency or artificial intelligence or whatever the next thing is. And so like, I don't think they realize how pissed off people are at that, how little they deserve our trust. And like, I'm done with taking as gospel this like cultish belief that whatever some tech CEO says is accurate, especially when they have like a clear financial interest in us believing their bullshit, whether it's space or Bitcoin. I know a bunch of Bitcoin bros are going to yell at us because they always do on Twitter, but like, give me a break. Come on.
Yeah, but the cautionary note I'd say like to this crypto utopianism is the same one you did, which is that techno-utopianism has not worked out well, And there might be some good things about crypto in the same way that there's some good things about social media. But, when you allow yourself to be convinced that you have the answer to all the world's problems, whether you're in politics or you're an entrepreneur, it tends to lead to some pretty difficult places. And look, the reality of this, too, is like I've been going a little bit deeper in this recently. There's some interesting things about crypto, right? The argument is this could be a way that dissidents in China can have a different currency. Or already you've seen the Chinese say, we're not going to deal with Bitcoin. We're going to start our own mines. We're going to set up our own crypto. Because of course that's what they're going to do. That's what any totalitarian government's going to do. And then of course what the U.S. government's going to do is say, we're going to have to regulate this because we don't know what people are laundering through this, who's washing dirty money through this. Never mind, it's not taxed. And so it starts to migrate to the kind of offshore haven type places. And yeah, like I think that the point for the crypto people, before they yell at us, like make your case. Like there's some good arguments about, the potential for crypto, but like this has not been thought through in a way that deals with the reality of the world as it is, I saw that tweet and I saw you kind of take that on. Because Jack Dorsey is usually a slightly more thoughtful guy than some of these other tech guys, but there's just this tendency to kind of hype whatever the next idea is without leveling with the downside risks. Yeah. And there's always a downside risk. And here the downside risks are clear. Like this can be manipulated by criminals. That can be used to launder money. Like you have to deal with that.
Right. Make your case, but like there's no circumstance in which it's going to unite a deeply divided country. It's Bitcoin, man.
It's going to unite like crypto investors, yes. But then it's not even to unite them, by the way.
Jack Dorsey in his summer house that he'll purchase when
well, it's
Bitcoin
not even to unite them because you're going to have these guys who are, running up the price and then crashing it so they can make money. Like, I don't know. I don't feel like that's
just rein it in. Just chill with the hyperbole. That's all we're saying.
It's another venue for capitalism. That's what it is. I mean,
Yeah. Thanks again to whoever purchases the first space ad. If it can be something less offensive than our guesses, I guess that'd be good. Well, I know the Delta stuff sucks and it's scary and everyone should be careful, but it was good to see New York back. It seemed like people were out, the city was alive. All the reports of its premature demise were nonsense, as we knew at the time. So, shout out New York.
And it felt like it felt like it's back, but also like people are, everybody's outside, everybody's eating outside. Like it feels a little bit more like pre-vaccine days, in terms of the care people are taking, and that's a good thing.
Yeah, it's a good thing. All right, well, that's it for today, and we'll talk to you guys next week.